much. Okay, do it. Sound check. Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. How's that? Sounds good. A little bit of feedback coming from that guy. Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. I got a loud voice too, so I'll speak up. Okay, come on in. We got seats in the front. You can come all the way up. I'm not that scary. You know, my new nickname in Juniper is Scary Barry. Okay, while we're doing the sound check, let me go ahead and do some brief introductions. So you're in the Service Fire Security tutorial, and just do a quick show of hands. How many people here deal with service fire security incidents in their networks every day, right? This is good. How many people here have seen this presentation before? Okay, there's a few people. Some people have helped, you know, like Patrick's helped, but he doesn't know he helped, you know. There's others out there with this. So this is a tutorial that's a very foundation-oriented tutorial. Several years ago, and this is where you see the black dots on the badges. If you don't have a black dot, get a black dot so you can see each other and know each other. And then tomorrow night, or tomorrow, tomorrow is the NSPsec BOF. So you want to come to that, and I'll explain why you want to come to that. Because our biggest offense in the industry, and I'll mention that, is actually each other. You can't buy a feature on some vendor that says stop DOS, stop security problems. You know, working with each other is our biggest security advantage, right? So as people come on in, oh, now I'm getting really intimidated. Heather's here and Chris is here. Oh my goodness. I'll point to people, and actually I can farm out questions and stuff. All right, so off the screensaver. Okay, ready to go? Tape? Okay, all right, so let's get going. Because even though this is fundamentals, and I'm covering what we call like the top 10 techniques we would like to get every service buyer to do, there's a lot of materials, and we only got an hour and a half, and we got buses who are going to take us off to an interesting party tonight, so we don't want to get in the way with that. So what this is presentation about, this is a primer that was put together several years ago by a community which I'll talk about, the NSPsec, which is Network Service Fire Security Group. It's a group that helps each other to protect each other's networks. My name is Barry Green. I'm now with Juniper Networks. I'm the director of the security incident response team there. So if you got Juniper gear and you got a security issue, I'm the guy you pick up the phone and give a call and say, yo, what's going on? What's wrong with your equipment? I'm the guy you yell at. I'm also involved with a lot of different operational security organizations out there. Operational security is the type of security that where you're not looking for problems, problems happen to you, right? So in other words, stuff happens to you, you're getting attacked, you're getting violated, you're getting DOS attacked, whatever, and you need help. Because we live in a world where you can't do this by yourself anymore. You need peers, you need to work with people. This material, it should go up, and if it's not up there, there'll be two versions. There'll be a PDF version, and there'll be a PowerPoint version. We designed the slides in such a way that it's free use, because one of the things that we found out years ago is that there are those people who are really good at service fire security, and they come up with the techniques and they deploy the techniques. So I'll point to Chris Morrow over here. He's one of the guys. He figured out a bunch of techniques on networks he's run, but I can do better slides than Chris can do. So he'll figure out the technique, and then I'll do the slides, right? And then Chris will use my slides in wherever company he's at, right? And this is where this kind of works. You know, Roland Dalvin's over here. He did this presentation last time, so he did a bunch of slides. So what we do is those of us who are good illustrators, we put them into slides. Those of us who are good technicians and figured out how to do stuff, we figure it out, and then we help each other out this way, and we make this free use. So that way you can take these slides, if you're trying to convince your management, we need to do this, you grab this slide deck, and you cut and paste into your company slide deck. That's what this is out there for. So this is how we're making it easy, because you seeing it here, you say, hey, I want to do that technique. Or I want to do another version of this technique, because these are all the basic. There are actually add-ons you can do to this that people have figured out. You need to convince your management. That's what these slides are here for, all right? So this is 10 basic ones. that are vendor independent. In other words, pretty much any vendor gear you get out there, you can use them. That was one of the criteria looking at to make it vendor agnostic as the foundation techniques. And these are the techniques when somebody picks up the phone and says, hey, I need help to stop a DOS attack. You need to be at the same level playing field. You can say, hey, let's black hole this thing, or let's sinkhole this thing, all right? You know, okay, I got a sinkhole set up in my system, I can sinkhole it. I got remote trigger black hole set up in my network, I can black hole it. That way you can work with your peers together using the same foundation baseline technique with it. So that's the idea of this stuff. And what's this all about? You know, what do you tell your boss when your network blows up from a DOS attack, whether it's intentional or collateral, right? So, and these things, you know, all happen out there. This watershed moment actually happened at a NANOG. Service provider security is kind of like a different field from like enterprise security. And it's really interesting. It's really hard to take somebody who's like, you know, certified and trained in enterprise security and get them to think in the service provider security world. Because what's different about it is enterprise security comes up in firewalls and IDPs and, you know, audits and audit trails and things like that. Where a service provider security guy is like, oh, let me route this problem. You know, you control backbones and routing protocols. It's a different mentality. And for instance, to get an engineer who's a security engineer thinking that you can actually use a routing protocol as your biggest strength, that to take and route to null zero is one of your best defensive tools that you have to protect your network, a guy who's used to firewalls and access lists can't get their mindset around it. It's a paradigm shift with it. So that's why this is a different field. In February 2000, we had these big press visible attacks. We had people running out of the room, go work in the attacks. And it was at that NANOG that, you know, certain people said, hey, we need to actually step up and start thinking about how are we going to protect the service provider backbones. And that's where this kind of started to evolve from. So, and, you know, overview, right? So, you know, there's all this stuff going out there. Now, there's a community out there, so this thing over here, this interesting Wired article, it's interesting to pull up with it because they call this the community of the vetted. All right, and I'll talk more about this group called NSPsec, which we highly encourage people to look at joining, because what this demonstrated, what this article demonstrated, is when the attacks happened against Estonia, okay, the people in Estonia, the networks in Estonia, were having a hard time figuring out how to defend themselves. But what was happening is immediately they reached out to NSPsec. We got like one particular guy from the Estonian Computer Emergency Response Team vetted into NSPsec. And then you had the entire world helping out Estonia. Every service provider backbone helping out Estonia, right? And one of the key ways that Estonia got back online was not by Estonia doing something by themselves, but by then collaborating with service providers all over the world. Our best defense is each other. So when you look around here in the room, right, getting to know each other is really, really important, because when stuff happens, we got to rely upon each other to defend ourselves. That's just the way that the end-to-end paradigm, you know, of the internet means we have to work with each other end to end to defend ourselves. So, and there's some more slides you can use in here that we put in with it. So, NSPsec is and this isn't like hierarchical or anything. I just kind of throw slides in there to kind of show, you know, the stuff in there. And there's you know, communities out there that work with each other. I'll dive into some of them. And NSPsec is one of them. Here's the URL with it. This is kind of where this all came from. I'll dive in a little bit more. Economic cycles. How many people here have heard Team Cymru? Okay, all right. So there's a guy over there, Rob Thomas. All right, he's one of I think the founder of Team Cymru, right? He noticed in conversations he and I are having many years ago that we're noticing as the criminals were coming into monetary. In other words, we don't have people who go out there and hack for fun. You can make tons of money at this, and so people hack for profit. They, you know, break into networks for profit. They DOS for profit. And then what we're watching after a couple of years, we're noticing certain things. And one of the things we noticed was that these cycles that go through. Like, for instance, DOS attacks. And this is one of the areas right now that you got to watch out for. People said, you know, 4 years ago there was lots of big DOS attacks. And then things happen, and we had a down cycle. So you have this down cycle going on, all right? And then you have DOS attacks on the rise. So we get more and more DOS attacks now, but the DOS attacks are different, all right? And because what happens is you have lots of problems going on, all right? With those lots of problems going on, the community mitigates the problem. Then what happens is the criminals go out there and they do research and development. and they actually do it better than the white hat people. So the black hats are better at the R&D. They come up with better tools, and they're back at it again. So what happens with service provider security is to be mindful that here you're looking at different techniques, and you may say, well, I don't have this problem right now. Well, this problem right now could be for many different reasons, right? And one of the reasons it could be is because we're in a trough right now compared to your business. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to get hit. It just means at this moment of time, there isn't any motivation or the bad guy technologies in there to go after you, right? So, you know, this is some of the things to be mindful of, that even though you're seeing it here and you may not face it, doing the preparation beforehand with a lot of these techniques is not capital intensive, and it's not like, you know, big labor intensive. A lot of the different techniques are actually, you know, you spend, you know, some time to doing it, and you can get it deployed, and then you're ready to go, and it's on standby. It's a system of defense ready to go in case you need it. Trying to build these techniques like a remote trigger black hole in the middle of a DOS attack is very finicky, you know. And I know I've been on big telco providers before in the middle of a DOS attack, and we've actually deployed remote trigger black hole in the middle of a DOS attack, and it can be done. But, you know, it would be much better that you actually have it prepared, and then when you get hit with a DOS attack, you say, okay, I can just drop the packets at the edge of my network, or send it over to a sinkhole, do whatever with it. You know, don't wait for the attack. Now, where all this stuff is coming from is coming from experience, right? So this is actually, we throw the slides out there to the NSP Sec community and the other peers out there, and they look through it, and they say, what about this, what about that? You know, if they have time with it. So it's actually come from the experience with it. And what we're doing over here is doing the empowerment part. So that's what this presentation's about. The other thing to keep where this is coming from is the 40-40, the 40-20-20 rule, the 40-40-20 rule. Sean Dillon, who actually can't come here much anymore because there was not funding in his new job at Department of Homeland Defense. But when he came here a lot, and when he was doing NSP Sec, service hour security stuff at SBC, he was noticing this pattern. The pattern being that, you know, whenever we get these patches and these upgrades, you know, Microsoft does their Patch Tuesday, that 40% of his customer base, you know, goes and upgrades right away. Another 40% takes time to look at it and figure out what to do with it and needs some nudging and will upgrade. But you always have that 20% that will never ever do anything. And these are the computers that get infected and violated and get botted and used in criminal activities. And that 20% is really, really hard to take care of. And that the 20% is a growing number. The net is growing dramatically, and that 20%, what used to be millions in computers when Sean was first noticing this, is, you know, tens of millions of computers, and then the devices like your hand phones, and, you know, be all over devices. So this problem set is growing. That 20% they talked about of the customers who just don't care and will never respond and never patch is going to keep on growing, which means the number of machines available to the bad guys are going to continue to increase. Right? Continue to increase with each of those devices having more and more horsepower of the sort of packets that can throw on the net. Right? So, and many of them go on mobile, which makes it even more interesting with it. So this problem set, this 40-40-20 rule, is something that's going to be with us for quite a long time, because there's not much that people can dent into this. People have looked at this. Microsoft looks at this. People cite this 40-40-20 rule. And this is one of the big dangers that we have to look at to make sure we have our networks as resilient as possible. All right. So to walk through these techniques, I'm just going to walk through them. There's a quick summary we do with it, you know. And then the other thing I mentioned about is know the enemy. As part of whether the steering committee puts me on the program committee or not, one of the things I'm going to be doing is, we noticed this past year that we need to do some more refresh of service provider security topics in NANOG. So what you're going to see is 1 or 2 good, solid speakers coming into NANOG. So those of you who are here the first time, come on back again, because we're going to have solid topics in there. If you can't make it, then watch the sessions when we put it online, since all the stuff is videotaped. And if you haven't had a chance, go back to the other security talks. Type in security as part of the keyword search of topics and look at some of the old videos that we have, because it talks about some of the threat vectors. So some of the first things we're going to do over the next NANOG, I'm going to get sessions on the new threat vectors in. So you can understand what is the threat out there, right? So how can you gauge the threat in today's threat? Because the threat environment has changed. It's all changed, and we want to get the information out to you so you can take that back to your organizations. All right, so we set this up in such a way where I put this executive summary. I'm going to flip through this executive summary to talk about these techniques. And it's in here so that way you can cut and paste and put in your slides, and you can go to your boss and say, here's what we need to do. Here's 10 slides. Here's what we need to do. So number one, you tell your boss that says, we need to prepare our network operations center. So our NOC needs to have procedures ready to go, written down, and I mean written down in paper, not like on some computer, but written down in your notebook. Because what happens if your computer fails? What if it's a virus or something like that? Have your procedures ready to go, exercise the procedures, practice those procedures. Don't wait until the last minute to go like, oh crap, what do I do now? All right? That's not a good thing to do. All right? Collaboration. It says, hey, we need to be part of these groups. We need to get vetted into these groups. If we're not part of these groups, we're at a disadvantage. All right? I'll give an example. Way back in Slammer, 2003, those networks that are part of NSPsec, they're able to recover really quick. Those networks that are not part of NSPsec, they're totally clueless and they were down. There was a direct differentiation between how to plug in to work with your peers and those people who weren't plugged in to work with their peers. All right? So it's really important to be able to invest in those communities and plug into them. INOC DBA. There's a phone system out there that NOCs use. Only autonomous system number and then the number on there. People plug in asterisk systems. We use this for conference bridges. We use this for operational security. Many different groups. Internet exchange points use it. All right? So INOC DBA gives you a phone system. So how do you call the key person at the other service provider? Well, this is a way of doing it. That way, when that phone rings, you pick up that phone. And if somebody ever sells red phones that look like the Batman phone, that would be really cool because then it's a red phone and it beeps and says, when that phone rings, pick it up because it's somebody you need to talk to. All right? Point protection. Really review and constant review, and every year you should go through and review your point protection. How do you protect your routers and switches and host inside your own infrastructure? Making sure your infrastructure can't be taken down. All right? Edge protection. All right? This is your infrastructure access list. It could be QoS. It could be how you recolor your packets. Edge protection. Looking at you have a right to determine what type of packets come into your network. Your boundary is a national boundary. That autonomous system boundary is something that you have control over. All right? You just don't say, I accept any packet in the world, and me, who lives on the other side of the world, I have a right to send my packet wherever I want to. That isn't an explicit right. Your autonomous system boundary is an autonomous system border control. So you have to say, here's my policy, here's how I enforce my policy, here's the sort of packets I allow through, here's the sort of packets I drop. And you can determine that sort of thing. Whatever network you have, whether it's a service provider or enterprise. Remote trigger black hole. This is probably one of the number one techniques that we use out in the net, and I'll walk through how this works. Remote trigger black hole is using BGP and just taking the packets and routing to null zero is what we do with it. All right? So you route them to null zero, and then it drops it down in the bit bucket. In other words, this tool is probably used the most out in the net to go out there and drop DOS attacks when DOS attacks are in action. Sinkholes. Instead of dropping the packet, take the packet to a section of my network and then analyze it. Because the packet's coming in, it's an attack in progress. I can see what's going on with it. And sinkholes, I'll talk about basic sinkholes, but some networks have taken sinkholes to really wild architectural innovation. I mean, some of the innovation that people have done in sinkholes. And that'll be one of the topics to go in there and see if I can get some of these guys to come in and talk how they've deployed sinkholes in their network, right, over the years. So sinkholes is one of our key analysis techniques. You take something like, for instance, Configure. How many people have heard Configure? Right? Tomorrow night I'll talk about Configure as part of the Configure working group. All the Configure is dumped into sinkholes. Right? So understanding what sinkholes are and understanding the multitude of uses with it, is in having it pre-deployed inside your network gives you options. Because that's what these tools are, is about giving options. You've heard this before. I hope you've heard this before. But BCP 38, if the packet comes into you and its source address isn't something that you said you can route to you, then you should drop it. Check that source address. All right? And there's a bunch of different techniques out there for doing this. There's not just unicast RPF and ACLs. There's a whole multitude of different techniques and technologies you can use to do source address validation as it comes into your network. Don't allow spoofing to come in. All right? So this is one of the enforcement things. Prefix filters. There's I'll be covering prefix filtering and kind of rushing a bit through it because there's a bunch to it. There's a tutorial I did 2 NANOGs ago in New York that you can pull up that goes through in-depth in prefix filtering. Prefix filtering is really critical because BGP glues us all together. And how many people remember with YouTube in Pakistan, right? That could be your network, right? That could be your network, all right? That was a remote trigger black hole that wasn't set up properly, all right? because the government says black hole YouTube, but the black hole got leaked out to the rest of the world, and what happened? Collateral damage, and the garbage leaked out all over the place. There are scenarios out there that you can go out there and people break into BGP speaking routers. Spammers like BGP speaking routers. So hackers go out there and scan. Some of the SSH scanning that goes on out there is they're looking for BGP speaking routers. And the bad guys buy and sell them. But the bad guys use them for spam. They don't use them to take out the net. You take 12 BGP speaking routers in different places of the world and deaggregate the net, and then what do you have happen? Ooh, bad stuff. So prefix filtering, important. Total visibility, total situational awareness. Understanding what's going on your network all the time. There's tons of data out there that's built into your network gear that you can tap into. Everything from, of course, you've all for NetFlow, we talk NetFlow, but how many people ever thought that NTP is a visibility tool? Anybody think of network tiering protocol as a visibility tool? Right? This guy, Peter Lofberg, who's one of the industry, gadfly personalities on the net, but one time he came up to me about 5 years ago, or not 8 years ago, he said, hey, you can use NTP as a security tool. I was scratching my head, goes in the lab, starts doing stress out there, and very, very much NTP jitter monitoring on there shows it. SLA tools, right? So there's lots of visibility tools you can do on your network, right? So that's the total visibility with it. There's a rolling slide. There's more out there. So some of the stuff we'll bring in, for instance, quarantine walled garden techniques. If you have a customer, and that customer has an affected computer, in the past, people said it was just way too expensive to clean that computer up. But now there are techniques that different providers have figured out cost-effectively how to start the remediation process, right? So Comcast last week announced their bit, right? And there's more out there, right? So Cox has theirs, Quest has theirs. So we want to bring these guys in and say, here's how our techniques work. Here's how we do it. Each of them is different. It fits and aligns towards their business practice. What it's showing is that a quarantine walled garden where I can identify, I know where the bad, infected computers are. How do I help my customer who's been victimized get cleaned up, right? So, there's techniques like that. There's core hiding techniques where you can, hide your core. Do you want everybody to see everything in your core? You can hide your core, right? So all these are to either to a point where they're not everybody agrees to it, or they're vendor specific, which is why they're not up here right now. But we're getting to a point where there's some of these techniques that get to where there's vendor neutral. In other words, you can do it on anybody's equipment, and everybody agrees to it. But there's other techniques. So when you start with this gets you started. Then there's more things to look at, and what things to look at depends on your business and your service. What you have on your network. So let's talk about the first one. Prepare your NOC. It's probably the most important one. Everybody has a NOC. I hope everybody has a NOC, whether it's a centralized NOC, a distributed NOC, big displays on your PCs, whatever. You have somebody who runs your network. No NOC is perfect. The thing is, you always want to work on improving the processes. And this is part of improving the processes, right? So inside the NOC, you need to have some sort of security awareness. Now, some people say, oh, you have a separate security team or integrated security team. And this is a question that always gets thrown at me. So my security operations center be the same as a network operations center? It says it all depends on your business. You've got to see what your business looks like. I've seen very successful big networks where their security people and their NOC people were one and the same. I've seen other successful businesses where there were two distinct teams. Right? So it all depends on your business with it, of how you put it together. But the key thing is to have people inside your operations who know operational security, who practice operational security. Where does the DOS attacks get escalated? Where are the guys who practice? Who are the guys who care about the tools? These are the things you need with it, right? So, and a process of constant improvement. Every time an incident happens, don't just say, okay, the incident's over and forget what happened. Go back and do a post-mortem and figure out how do I make things better? Because it's going to happen again. There's a cycle with all this. It's going to happen again, right? And what you want to prepare for is as it happens again, it's not in this presentation, but there's another presentation I've done where I talk about what's happened with convergence. There's a talk I give in the Juniper mindset where I say, long live the internet died 2 years ago. We don't have an internet anymore. What we have is a global telecommunications system that rides on IP. And if you look at it, convergence has happened and we didn't realize it. So when something happens today, tomorrow more convergence is going to happen. So today on your network, you may not have emergency life reported services that the FCC requires reports for because it's life-dependent services today. But tomorrow you probably will, right? And on those services, that go down, people's lives are at stake. I can't pick up the phone and call 911 because your service is being DOSed, right? That's a serious sort of thing. And that's what's happening with convergence, right? All the regulatory stuff that happened in the old telco world is coming on all the internet people. And this is changing the way you have to think. So while we have that 20% of the badness that keeps on growing, we also have convergence to happen to us that's making it more critical. So you can't just let this stuff to say, oh, well, I have my DOS attack, the DOS attack is over, let me go do my next job. You got to look at how can I make things better, because it's going to come again. It's just part of what we have. Because you don't want to get up there and say, okay, I practice, I do, and then, it's like the fire department going to a fire and say, oh, how does the fire engine work? You have to practice these things. Throw some stuff in the lab. It can be done in the lab. Go back to the original 2002 NANOG. There was Chris and Brian, right? So I got them in, and they taught, here's how we do remote target black hole at Verizon Business. And then, the day before, Chris says, oh, we should demonstrate this. Barry, go get us some routers. So I go over and I grab a whole bunch of routers, and they set up a demonstration. And all it was a demonstration we set up in the front. We had like 5 or 6 different routers, and there were small routers, and he was able to demonstrate, here's how the technique works. So you can do this sort of thing and try it and practice it in a lab before we get out in the network. All right? The same thing with firemen. All right? You've got to practice before you go to the fire. You can't train on the scene of the fire. Yeah, I got to have a methodology around this. You don't wait until the emergency to say, okay, what do I do? All right? You got to not only drill, but you got to have a method behind the madness. So this is one of many different approaches, right? And this is an approach that we can deep dive and drill on it, where you go through and the first thing you do is preparation part, and then when an incident happens, so you like use a DOS attack, you got to find out, okay, what type of DOS attack is it? Is it saturating my bandwidth? Is it a state-oriented DOS attack? Is it ICP? Is it TCP? What is it? Then I got to classify, okay, where's this coming from? Who's it attacking? What impact has happened? Then trace it back. Where's it coming in from? Right? Now I have enough information, say, now I go out there and react. And how do I react? Which tool is appropriate to react? Because you have different types of DOS attacks out there. And there's different techniques you want to do with it, all right, of how are you going to react with it. Because there's DOS attacks out there we see DOS attacks that are designed to trick you. Oh, let me go out there and drop everybody's source address, do a source address drop. Because I got 20 different source addresses that I got as part of this DOS attack. And I don't look at the source addresses. I don't notice the source addresses equal Yahoo and Google and Microsoft and all the critical sites, because they're spoofed. They're coming in as spoofed. So they're not actually the real sites, but I go out there and do a source address black hole. Now I just knocked off all my other customers from going to Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo. Now I got all my customers calling me up. And we've seen those sort of tricks that the bad guys will play. All right? So this is why it's having some of the method and not just automatically say, oh, let me throw this tool at it. All right? So the methodology behind it is really, really important with it. So mitigation communities. As I said before, our best defense is ourselves. So there's a bunch of them out there, all right? And there's more out there that you can do with it, all right, with the mitigation communities. And I'm just going to dive into the first one. Like if you have not part of any how many people here, raise their hands, how many people here are part of NSPSec? Okay, so this is, we got a lot of good new people here, so we want to get you there tomorrow at the same time, wherever the room's at for the NSPSec BOF. D-Shield, how many people have got their home networks set up for D-Shield at least? Anybody home network set up? Oh, one other person. D-Shield is a good tool that anybody who's not into logs and doing forensics, one advantage I got with D-Shield is that it shows that community defense works. Right? You can take your home network, you can send your logs, you send whatever's scanning your network, you send it into a collective IDP firewall log analyzer, and you get these charts out of them. And they get alerts about what's scanning you. And then if anybody wants to find out what sort of badness is hitting your system, right, then you go out there and you subscribe to the fight back. So for instance, it's interesting, on Juniper Networks, I'm signing up all the autonomous systems for Juniper Networks over to Fightback. And I get these emailed reports every day. And it's really interesting seeing stuff that comes out of our network, hitting other people's stuff that we have to go plug up as infections happen inside networks. Right? So that sort of data, what's it cost me? It cost me an email address. For Juniper Networks to get that data, it costs me an email address. That's what it costs you. You can set up an email account, and you as a service provider or a network operator, everybody here who's responsible for networks, you can sign up the DShell and you can get these reports. And what the reports give you is it says your computers are actually knocking on other people's doors. It's a firewall log. Your packet got dropped somewhere. It's an IDP log. It got dropped somewhere. All right? So this is an example of community-based sort of defense mechanisms. All right? NSPsec is another one. It's a closed community, and it's focused in its network service providers, focused on infrastructure. We've got many other operational security communities out there today. So we've got a healthy community of different operator security communities. NSPsec has a very, can the backbone move packets from point A to point B? That's what NSPsec is focused on. All right? So it's not focused on so much of, let me analyze the malware. Yazamil does that. II does that. MWP does that. Right? They look at the malware and start dissecting the malware and looking what's going on in the malware. Right? There's other groups like OPSEC Trust. What are the bad guys doing? How are they making money off this? How can we disrupt the whole bad guy operation? NSPsec is the infrastructure A-OK? Is the SLAs all being met? Is there a DOS attack that's threatening us? Is there a BGP incident that's threatening us? Is there a botnet that's big enough that it's going to threaten our networks? Right? That's NSPsec. Focus on those sort of things. To find out more information, you got the URL here. And then tomorrow night, we'll talk some more about it. Now, there's a vetting realm that goes in with it. And the reason why there's vetting information going on is because there's a trust level. And the trust level is that me as a network operator, I'm getting hit with an attack. Now, for me to get your guys' help, I need you guys to help me. I need to give you details. Now, these details are intimate details. These details, it says, hey, I was working this attack. Here's the address. This is my customer who's under attack right now. Here's who's attacking. Here's the addresses that attacking me. Can you guys help me out? Right? Does anybody see these addresses in your list? Can you look at your NetFlow logs? We're exchanging information that if lawyers were in the room, they would have a heart attack. Because they'd go like, oh my goodness, why are you sharing this information? That's confidential information. You shouldn't be sharing that. But you need to share that to collaborate with each other. Right? So that's why there's this trust vector, where you have people who vet you in to say, yes, I know this person, I work with this person. This is somebody who's not going to go blabbering their mouth to the press over the sort of information we exchange with each other so we can defend ourselves. Right? So that's where the vetting comes in with it. So that's why coming to groups like this, putting the black dot on, coming to a tutorial like this, going to NSPsecBoF, talking to other people in the halls. If you see a black dot on them, just go up and say, hey, hi. Introduce yourself. And this is the sort of thing we need to do, to go out there and build the trust relationships out there so we can defend ourselves. Because this sort of thing happens all the time. Service provider A is hit with a DOS attack. It's a DOS attack that's causing collateral damage. In other words, one customer is getting hit, but he's getting hit, on his, 1 meg connection, and he's getting 40 megs of DOS attack. Well, those 40 megs don't just disappear. Those 40 megs go all the way down to the router that's supporting that 1 meg connection. Well, where does the other 39 megs go? All right, well, that PE router starts dropping them. Well, that PE router may not be powerful enough to drop them. And now you have all the connections connected to that PE router dropping connections. So you have collateral damage. All right? So 40, is a big number. All right? So you can't do it by yourself, so you're going to need some help. So you do your part, but then you talk to NSPsec peers and say, hey, can you guys help me stop this attack? Here's the destination address. Can everybody stop all packets going to this destination address? And then people say, yeah, no problem. And you start working it back. And they say, if you can find out the source addresses, give me source addresses, because I think this is spoofed. And people will look at their interface logs, look at the flow logs, and they're showing you information. Right? So then you get this information feeding into you, and you start working the attack to figure out, okay, how do I really stop it? A lot of times what happens today is says, okay, here's the source address. What botnet is it coming from? Anybody spot the control channel? Let's go after the controller for the botnet. And then we go take off the control of the botnet and then cut off the head of the botnet. All right? So this is typical sort of collaboration that happens in the NSPsec community. All right? So, and this is this whole realm about operational trust. where you got to trust your people, to meet the expectations. It's like trusting your buddy behind you, your wingman or whatever. Right? This is the sort of trust that happens. And this is the sort of thing, unfortunately, this is how we're going to keep the internet glued together. This is how we're going to keep global telecoms together. Because we don't have a way to really stop the bad guys. Right? The bad guys, we out there and remove their botnet, then they go build another botnet. Because remember that 40-40-20 rule. That 20% is always going to be there. The bad guys are always going to have more computers to go after and break into. We don't have a way to go in there and bust down the door of the bad guy and go put him in handcuffs and throw him in jail for 40 years. We don't have a way to do that internationally with an international legal system. And it's not going to be like, the international legal system allows us to do this, isn't going to be around for a long time. That means us who run the backbones, we got to put up with this all the time. The criminals are always going to be out there with it. All right? So more on the operational trust. Now, NSPsec is not perfect. Right? It wasn't designed to be perfect. All right? It's not designed to solve all the problems for operational security. There are other groups. Fortunately, other groups go out there and there's specialization groups. Right? So this is good. All right? But it's a tool, and it's an example I give here that you can do as part of this. Now, those of you may have networks that say, hey, I've really got to look at what's going on with the malware. All right? Well, Yazimil grew out of NSPsec. Yazimil means yet another security mailing list, is what Yazimil means. But Yazimil does a group as equivalent group, same sort of vetting structure. But their specialization is to dice apart the malware. New piece of malware comes across, their guys are pulling it apart. How does this work? Where's the control channels? How do I destroy the control channels? How do I clean it up? You have operators on there, you have antivirus guys on there. All right? So there are other groups out there. And if you're interested in some of this, you can email me. You can talk to other people tomorrow night because there'll be a bunch of us there. Tomorrow you'll hear about the Configure working group. So you see more about what's going on with Configure. All right? So, and then here's BOFs, by the way. Certs. How many people have their service provider, or your organization part of FIRST, the FIRST.org? Wow, one hand goes up. All right, 2 hands. This is good. 3. All right? This is another group. Meets all the time. The security incident response teams around the world, they have their group, which is FIRST.org. There is no reason why any service provider in the world cannot form, to take their SOC, the Secure Operations Center, and have them be part of FIRST.org. It's another group, sharing information, doing the meetings, working the incident response, and a lot of times what happens, you're going to see this more, is these CERT teams are working with each other on global vulnerability issues, industry-wide vulnerability issues. So if you want to be plugged into this sort of stuff to get a heads up, this is a different trust community also working it, but working from this angle. All right, so this is also something to look at. All right, INOC DBA. How many people here have INOC DBA? Yeah, there's a few more hands up there. Mine is plugged into my house. So, and unfortunately, I haven't had time to plug Juniper in, so if you call Juniper, it won't work to me. So INOC DBA is basically, this is the website with it. Packet Clearinghouse kind of put it together. The community kind of made it all happen because more and more phones go in there. It's a SIT-based system using enum, right? But the numbering scheme that we use is a, well, I'll talk about it. We'll get to that. So what is the problem we're trying to solve on INOC DBA? Well, since Chris is here, I'll pick on Chris. Chris Morrow calls me up and says, I really got this problem. Because I use this story in my talks all the time. I use Chris Morrow's story. So Chris called me up and said, I called Sprint one time, and I'm trying to work a DOS attack. And I called their NOC, right? And Sprint goes, well, what's your customer ID? He says, well, I don't have a customer ID. I'm a peer to you. So you need a customer ID. And he didn't have a customer ID. He says, well, I can't help you. And Sprint NOC hangs up on him, right? So he runs into this, how do I talk to the right person over at Sprint? I need to talk to the right person at Sprint so we can collaborate with each other to stop this DOS attack, right? This is what the problems that we're solving with INOC DBA, right? So INOC DBA is when you dial that phone number, you dial autonomous system number, colon, and then some number. And what many people do is they set it up to an asterisk system, right? So like NTT America, they're running off the asterisk system, right? So you can call anybody in their company through INOC DBA. Right? So you can go to that extreme with it. And this system worked in the middle of Slammer. So here we're having lots of DOS issues with the Slammer big stress on the net, and we're talking to each other on NANOG DBA conference bridge. Why? Because NANOG DBA is in your network, and you control the backbone, and it kind of all just kind of works quite well. You get statistics. Bill Woodcock, who's around, or some of the other people from Packet Clearinghouse, they look for the PCH. They can give statistics with it, and we got presentations they've given on NANOG. You can look up on NANOG DBA. But one of the interesting things that they show is that there's a consistent number of calls every day. In other words, people talk to each other, use NANOG DBA to call all the time, right? And so that number is every day, but the duration of the call increases correlated when there's stuff happening on the net. So when stuff is happening on the net, the duration of the call increases by times 10. So in other words, it's the same group of people who are keeping the net glued together, talking to each other. This is kind of how they talk to each other. When that phone rings, somebody I want to talk to is ringing me, right? When the other phone rings, it's an irate customer who's upset. Okay, which phone do I pick up? Irate customer who's yelling at me, or this customer who's my peer at another provider? Okay, I'll pick up this phone, right? So it's kind of like, which phone do I pick up sort of thing. And when there's a problem, I pick up the phone and I ring, and I put people on bridge, and we work on a problem together and you're on longer. So this is what happens on NANOG DBA. You go to the website. It's very easy to set up these days. It's PCH.net. This is Patrick Falstrom, who's out in the industry. This is a picture of his nephew back when he plugged in his NANOG DBA system to kind of use that. It's really straightforward to getting hooked up these days with it. So, and it's being used as a bunch of like DGIX in Stockholm. They got a whole bunch of phones. There's a bunch of exchange points. You go to the site to show you which exchange points are using it. So a lot of exchange points are using it for like troubleshooting on exchange point work. So NANOG DBA. Point protection. This is protecting the router itself. This is making sure that each network device out there, you don't leave it naked to the outside world, because these things get broken into. People look to break into routers. And it's surprising, Probably about once every other week, I get notified by some peer in the network says, oh, wow, we just found this intelligence because some Juniper router got broken into over here. Now, it's not controlled by Juniper Networks, but they're calling me up because they're trying to help figure out, how to contact that party to say, hey, your router's owned, okay? And criminals, especially the commercial criminals, want to go after these routers. They find ways of using them to support the criminal activity. Everything from routing tunnels through it, set up tunnel connections, to using it to inject BGP routes for 15 minutes and then deject and withdraw the routes. So they add and withdraw specific routes, right? So they can pump spam behind it. So they're after these routers. They like to do with it. And so it's important for people to kind of really pay attention to it. And pay attention from a holistic standpoint. Don't just say, okay, I just put a VTY access list on it. You want to look at it from a holistic perspective of you sitting at home or sitting here. How many people here, this is interesting, how many people here are currently logged onto a router in the room? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So you got to think of yourself in this room, as you're in this room, and look at the whole path between you and this room all the way to your routers, right? And is this whole path secure, right? And that's the sort of security we're talking about with point protection with it, is between you and here at NANOG, right, and your routers back at home, are they secure? So you start everything from the SSH on the router, VTY access list. You're talking about looking at the path. What do you use to connect up? There's like for instance, Juniper routers telnet is not configured automatically. You have to manually configure it. We'd rather you configure SSH, right, for example. So go encrypted path, that sort of thing. But as you do this stuff, walk through the devices. Are you using AAA? In other words, are you just putting passwords on the router, or are you using some sort of AAA to it? If you're doing AAA, are you using AAA that has the whole path secure? How do you secure the whole path with it? Because a lot of people throw up Radius. Oh, Radius does it. But Radius, when you look at it from Radius in its most default version, if you don't do some certain tricks, you can have commands going in the clear between the router and the server over here. So look at the whole holistic part of it, all right? Are you using one-time passwords, right? So one-time passwords used to be like, oh, wow, very expensive. But one-time password systems are very cheap these days, right? So all these sort of things add up for protecting routers because they're after it. Your AAA servers, have you checked the path to your AAA servers? Because a bad guy knows, says, okay, how do I go after the service provider? Let me DOS their AAA servers. All right? And what happens to your router when your AAA server disappears? Oh, I default to my default. Okay, well, how often do you change your default passwords on your router? How many people have left your company, right? Do you change, every time somebody leaves your company, do you go out there and change, your MD5 keys and your passwords and roots and things like that? Do you change? No. I mean, you're supposed to, but, it's just too tedious to do that sort of stuff, right? So you got to assume that information like that could be out there in the marketplace, all right? The bad guy marketplace, all right? So you got to look at how to take care of it. Doing things like distributing your AAA servers in different parts of the network. So it's, out there. So TACX Plus and other things out there, right? So the other thing to look at is look at your protection on your router. Cisco RACL, Juniper LO0 filters, right? I don't know what Huawei and Alcatel uses, but everybody has their equivalent. You got to look at these filters and how you set these filters up on the router and audit them every year and look at them, all right? Don't just say, okay, I got certain protections in there and I don't look at what's being hit on my router. As a matter of fact, looking at the drops off of these lists give you really good intelligence on the visibility part, all right? I'll give an example of this. Back in 2000, there's one network who was also a TV channel that knew they were going to get hit with a DOS attack. And the reason why they knew to get hit with a DOS attack was two tools. They took their host protection ACL and they logged all the drops. So they'd permit, deny any TCP, deny any IP, log, okay? Then they took that syslog and they put it in an MRTG graph. They had a graph. And it said, every day, here's how many people are knocking on my door. Here's how many drops I get every day. Then all of a sudden, 1 month before the elections in 2000, the US elections, it spiked. It went multiplied times 10. And it stayed there, multiplied times 10. Right? And what that told them was somebody's really paying attention to our network. Somebody keeps on scanning our network, trying to figure out what's going on in the network. Now, what did it cost them? A configuration on the router, pump it off the syslog, MRTG, pump it into a graph. Right? We get these scans all the time, hitting our routers. Right? And this is valuable telemetry information. And it's stuff you need to look at because you not only look at says here's how much knocking on the door happens, but what type of knocking on the door? Am I getting hit with telnet, SSH? Oh, they just shifted protocol. Now they're looking for radius. Oh, now they're looking for, why are they looking for radius? Or now they're sending these other packets to me that they shouldn't send. All right? I'm getting, different ports that are not, it tells you information. And this information goes through and says, I need to look at my network. Do I have some port open that shouldn't be open? All right? So that's why you do this perspective of pushing the access list out to your, on the router devices itself. Okay? So another thing is how many people got Rancid running? Rancid, yes. Rancid, powerful security tool. Because Rancid is one of those tools that's popped up several times in the past where people have found out their network was owned only because of the Rancid changes. I mean, we're talking about whole networks where they had like over 20 routers broken into, and the only way they found out was somebody looked at it and say, hey, I got Rancid errors. Because the bad guys were on the router and configuring things into the router. And Rancid popped up and says, oh, there's a, who changed here? And they go in there and start looking at it, and they found out, oh, wow, okay, this whole network is owned. Right? So Rancid is not only a tool for you to manage your configs, but it's also an important security tool because it monitors and says, anytime there's a change on your network, you should go out there and have a log of who's changing what where. All right? So, point protection. Edge protection. This is draw your autonomous system and think of it as a national boundary. That's your autonomy. You have control over that. This is kind of like my personal rant about, you have control over your autonomous system. You set up an organizational policy. What packets go in, what packets go out, what service go in, what services go out. And then you have the power of network gear today to enforce that. Or firewalls, or whatever you want to enforce it with. And this is what we're talking about with edge protection. You got to figure out what you're going to protect with. And there's several different techniques you can do with it. So you go out there and say, I don't want the outside world to send telnet into me, for example. In my network, I should have no telnet ever come in and reach any of my routers. And that will be a policy. And then you go out there and enforce it on the edge. Right? This is an example of the sort of things you can do on the edge. So this is where you get this kind of infrastructure access list, this IACL concept. Infrastructure access list, is that access list that you put on all the devices facing out from your network, from peering routers to customer routers. All right? And that access list is designed to say, here's what goes into my infrastructure, and here's what passes through to all my services, whether it's a transit service or you as a service provider doing some financial service or web services or whatever. All right? Starting with, you can start with deny any of your space from external. In other words, you have infrastructure access links. Why should you allow anybody in the world, if you have inside a backbone link and router A and B, 2P routers, so the link between 2P routers inside your network, why should anybody in the outside world ever ping those two connections? Why should they go out there and try to telnet in those two connections, right? So you can say, okay, on that particular, link between those 2P routers, don't allow any traffic to go directly to them. That doesn't stop people from doing transit across. Transit works just fine. But that link should be protected because that's critical to your service. So that's where we talk about, where you can go through, there's a lot of stuff you can go out there by default and figure out what you should put in that infrastructure access list. Things like fragmented packets. Fragmented packets, any of your routers, right? Anything in your router should never receive a fragmented packet. If a fragmented packet reaches your router, then something's broke. You don't even need to look at that packet if it's a fragmented packet. You just need to know fragmented packets are hitting my router, something's broke. You see fragmented packets in my network, it means one or two things. Something's broke or somebody's attacking me. Right? Because it's hitting your router, it's hitting your switch, it's hitting your host infrastructure gear. Those are the things in there. Right? It's different from fragmented packets end-to-end at some application over a wireless link in Africa. Right? It's a different sort of scenario. That's not what's coming into you. Right? So you look at certain things, you can automatically figure out what should I put in my infrastructure access list. It kind of comes up really clear if you start thinking through. Permit transit traffic through it, right, for all your services, so you identify those with it, right, and the fragment to the core. Example, anything with source 127.0.0.1, right? So you look at, groups like that, right? So you kind of group them all together, what sorts of things you pass in there with it, all right? If anybody hasn't deployed infrastructure access lists, then here's a quick methodology you can use with it. It's we've used this in many different deployments of how to deploy an infrastructure access list, which is not do it all at once. I've seen many providers go out there and they spend months and months and months trying to build this very complicated list. And what happens is they never get it deployed because it's so complicated. Sometimes the best way to do it is do it in phases. You take the things you can do, you start with those, right? And you start adding to it. So you phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, and you start learning with it, right? So you can go through like number 1, put up a list and say, here's my idea, but don't drop anything. Just permit them all and count them. So then you can validate it. It says, okay, here's all the stuff that I permit through. Here's the stuff I want to drop, and you count it. So then you can get the swing, what we call a classification stage. How much badness is already out there? You say no SSH going into, SSH or telnet going into my routers. Instead of dropping it first, I just permit it and count it and say, oh, wow, there's a lot going on here. All right. And then you can say, okay, is any of this critical? Did I miss anybody? Did I miss any service? Am I going to impact anybody? Is any heads going to pop up because I just dropped this? And this classification stage helps you figure out what heads are going to pop up when you do this. All right. Then you begin to filter and don't try to do everything in detail. You do, here's the things I know I can need to drop. You shouldn't get source address 127.0.0.1, for example, coming in. You can say, okay, don't want to have SSH and telnet, so I drop those. All right, so you get that done, you get it deployed, make sure your network's stable, you take a deep breath, say, oh, okay, this is good. All right, then you look at your logs and say, okay, what's the next level of things I want to do? Maybe phase 2. All right, so this is a kind of like a phased approach that can keep your network more stable that way than versus trying to say, okay, I want to try to filter everything. You have months of meetings trying to figure out everything to filter, right? Sometimes it's better just to start doing it and roll it out in phase than to try to make it all perfect, because it's never going to be perfect, right? So then you roll out your basic protection, and then you just increase deployment, and you just keep on with your cycle with it, right? So it's, and the other thing to think about is infrastructure access lists are never going to be a perfect tool. So this is a tool in your toolkit, but it's never going to be perfect. So when people say, hey, I got infrastructure access lists, I'm all protected, right? And then some vendor comes out and says, oh, here's a vulnerability of this crafted packet. And it goes right through your infrastructure access list, right? They're never going to be perfect tools out there. So this adds resilience to the network to problems, but don't think of this and don't communicate to your bosses that, hey, we got infrastructure access lists, so we're all protected. It's like when people say, hey, I put a firewall in front of my network, I'm protected. I'm secure, I got a firewall. No, it doesn't work that way, right? It's the same thing with these. There's just a layer of your defense with it. Remote trigger black hole. BGP, it surprises people when we say BGP is one of our most powerful security tools. And it ended up that way, right? How many people here are martial arts people? Anybody martial arts guys? There are hard styles, soft styles. Hard styles, brute force, hit each other. The soft styles where you kind of redirect the opponent's energy, right? So Aikido, you kind of redirect the opponent's energy. Somebody comes at you, instead of just meeting them head on, you kind of redirect them. And that's what we're doing with BGP. We're redirecting the energy. Attack comes at us, instead of putting brute force and trying to throw a firewall ACLs right in front of that attack, what we're doing is we're redirecting the energy to null zero, to a sinkhole, to a shunted service, to a cleanup service, right? So the basic remote trigger black hole is the first of many different uses of using BGP to, instead of being brute force against the badness, you kind of redirect it to the direction you want to go. Because us, as people who control the routing protocols, we control the flow. We control traffic flow. We're traffic engineers. That's what we do. So what we're doing is we're engineering the DOS attack and the badness to the direction we want to go. And this is the mental hoop that a lot of security people have to change and get a different mindset, paradigm shift, to understand this and many other techniques we're using BGP with, right? So here's a network layout, and I have BGP across my network. And basically, in my NOC network operations center here, I have what I call a trigger router. This could be a router. It could be a box. Like Arbor does this. Arbor has a trigger element to it, right? For example, right? So you take and you say, okay, I want a black hole. I got an attack going on somewhere. So over here, I send in the BGP advertisement. The BGP advertisement then gets flooded to every router inside my network. And then on those routers, I have a configuration set up. And that configuration could be, there's basically two approaches we use. We use a static route pointer, or we use a community pointer. The community pointer gives us more granularity. So that's what most people use, is using the community. So this advertisement over here has a particular community, and based off that community, we do something. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to send it to null zero. So now I can have a DOS attack coming in through all my network. And I could say, okay, I need to stop it on my edge. Because when it all adds up and hits my customer down here, my target, this is big bandwidth all hitting one PE router. And what I need to do is I need to lessen the damage. I need to push the attack out here. Now, from a service perspective, with the customer getting hit, they're getting a DOS attack, you can immediately, they call you up and say, I need help with a DOS, right? Say, okay, no problem. What's your address? Says, okay, let me give you some relief. Remote trigger black hole. You now push the attack off the targeted IP address, and you push it up to all these guys over here. So you drop it over here. These routers over here are more likely to take it. You go to a customer and says, I've just given you partial service recovery. The address under attack is still DOSed. It's just, instead of hitting down here, the address is black holed over here. Okay? But all your other addresses, you can still now send traffic. Before, he couldn't send any traffic. The link was choked up. You've just given him partial service recovery. Right? He doesn't have full service recovery. Right? For full service recovery, you need to get some cleanup tools and sifting tools, other products in there to do full service recovery. But this gives you partial service recovery. Right? Now, this technique is used over and over and over again. How many people here have this configured in their network? Right? So this technique is out there. It works. Right? you can look around tomorrow and you can talk to different people who've got it deployed in the network. There's many different deployment, I've gone through. I'm talking about, I don't know, 50 different networks I've worked with, getting this deployed in a network. And the deployment of this, you can do it in a way, deploying a network, where it doesn't incur any downtime. Right? You can deploy it in the middle of a DOS attack. I highly recommend you don't deploy it in the middle of a DOS attack. But there's been 2 big national carriers in the middle of a DOS attack where the bank was getting hit and said the way for us to stop this is deploy this technique. Right? Because they couldn't throw ACLs to stop it. And this is the technique of deploy. So this kind of works out. We got white papers on this. Right? So vendor-specific white papers. The Cisco's got a white paper. Juniper's got a white paper on, or Juniper's got slides on it. Go through the configuration with it. There's lots of peer advice you could get questions on it. This is a question you can throw out in NANOG and say, hey, can people send me pointers to how to configure remote target black hole on my network? You'll probably get a lot of private answers, a lot of experience about how to do this, right? And how we do this in the industry is when you do it on your network, you can continue on, right? This is where I showed this slide before, where you can work it all the way back. It's a hammer, and it's not a perfect tool, but it's very common. A carpenter uses a hammer all the time. Right? So it's a common tool you use, right? But it's not a tool that you're going to use in every situation as a carpenter, right? And there's consequences with it too. Unfortunately, because the service providers found this tool, and we found this is a very effective tool to stop the bad guy's control channel. So we see a botnet, you see the controller, we black hole it on the net. So everybody black holes it, all right? Then the bad guys say, oh, okay, I'll move off of a IRC control channel, and I'll move to peer-to-peer. So unfortunately, one of the reasons why we have peer-to-peer botnets today is because we got very good at black holing their controllers. All right? So there's consequences with this, right? But it's a tool that I recommend every provider. If you have multiple routers and you have BGP in your network, have this thing pre-configured and ready to go. All right? So it's out there. Right? Here's some white papers out there. There's another tutorial with this. There is Chris kind of walked through this when it was at Verizon back in 2002. So this has been out for a while, 2002. You can pull up his presentation where he and Brian Gremlin, right? Who's still working at school system or hosting company now, right? And so they came in and they actually walked through in detail. Here's the configs we used, right? Here's how we did this. Here's a demonstration on routers how we did this. Here's how we do it in the network at the time, right? So straight up with it. And also on there is an RFC on this, right? And there's a new internet draft that Warren Kamari is doing on source space drop, right? So there's added to this. And then we're going to look at, there's other papers on how to do sinkholes and stuff. So let's talk sinkholes. So sinkholes is kind of like the Swiss Army knife. Now, some people say, oh, aren't you talking about honey nets? No, different. So a sinkhole is something that you engineer into a network. It's something that you're going to throw a lot of packets down a pipe to analyze with it. And it's a Swiss Army knife because the uses that people are finding out with sinkholes is multitude. Now, one of the uses you can use in a sinkhole is to put a honey net in it. All right? So honey net and sinkholes are 2 different things. A sinkhole is something that you engineer into your network and you can put a honey net into. But a honey net is not a sinkhole. Okay? That's the thing to think about. You wouldn't take and throw a DOS attack into a honey net. It would die, right? So where in a sinkhole, you would throw a DOS attack into a sinkhole because it's designed to take that level of attack traffic, right? You can use it to monitor all sorts of things. You can use it to black holes, tar pits, shunts, honey nets, honey pots, all these different things you can put inside of a sinkhole, right? So, and this is the thing that it's not the same, the honey net and the sinkhole with it. And the reason why you get into the slides here. So here's an attack scenario, right? So I got across my network, I got an attack going into a customer, right? Customers called me up and said, hey, I need help with this DOS attack. What do I do with it? Now I can use the same remote trigger black hole, but instead of taking the black hole and pointing it to null 0, I point the black hole to my sinkhole. And my sinkhole over here is designed to take, over here this could be a 40 gig attack. And I designed that to be a 40 gig sinkhole. Now, 40 gigs is a lot of traffic, right? So this is where you get techniques like anycast sinkholes, right? But say this over here is designed to take the attack. And you want to make sure it's designed to take the attack, because if it's not designed to take the attack at that speed, then what's going to happen is you're going to take down that sinkhole. Right? So what I do over here is I go and advertise this address. This is the address under attack. And advertise it into the sinkhole. So now I'm able to monitor the attack. Now, the customer just got partial service recovery. Right? His /24 that he has down here, he's got a /24. All the /24 is back in operation except for that one IP address that's DOSed. Okay? So, and that one IP address is DOSed, I'm advertising that /32 over here. Now inside the sinkhole, I can start seeing what's going on with this guy. I can point it at a honeynet. I can point it at a honeypot. I can do all sorts of little things with it. I can also monitor when the attack disappears. I can also monitor if the attack disappears, did the attack rotate? Because what these bad guys will do is they'll do rotate. They'll rotate their attacks. Now, rotating attacks means they shift the attack. So basic rotation would be shift the IP address. So he shifts the IP address and he attacks a different IP address down here. Because these bad guys who do DOS attacks, they're not DOS attacks. They're extortion. They're blackballing. They're political, let me take down the site. There's a human motivation behind these things. They just don't DOS for fun. There's some sort of motivation. There's either criminal motivation because they're doing it for money, or there's a political motivation because they have some political gain behind it, which means that they're monitoring these attacks, which is why a lot of times shutting these into a sinkhole allows you to monitor what's going on and see what's going on with it so we can collect more data so you know what happens when they rotate. All right? And they can rotate with IP addresses. They can rotate with their different state attacks. They can throw different state attacks at you. They can start with ICMP and then shift to IP and shift to TCP, shift to TCP, small window size, fragment attacks. You do all sorts of different things with it. All right? So here, what I've done is I've just pulled the attack away from my customer. I've given him partial service recovery. Also, this router down here, I've eliminated collateral damage. Okay? Because I pulled the attack off. And now I start working in the sinkhole. Now, what I put inside the sinkhole, put all sorts of monitors. Right? We use this SQL, this is, and you can use it to monitor things like SQL worms and things like that. We know badness out in the net. We know what computers get infected because what happens is people configure their sinkholes and they put some dark IP address space in it. What's dark IP address space? Dark IP address space is space you haven't allocated. You have light address space, you've given it to somebody. You have dark address space, you haven't given it to anybody. You can use sinkholes, configure your network, and put your dark IP address space instead of configuring it on the router and let it not do anything. Because when you put an aggregate on your router and send it to null zero, it doesn't do anything. Packets get scanned, packets arrive at the router, and they don't do anything. If I take that dark IP address space I haven't allocated and I stick it into a sinkhole instead and put some simple monitors on it, everybody who's scanning sequentially and scans in dark IP address space, they hit the sinkhole. Now I can start seeing, oh, wow, here's all my customers who scan in the net. That computer's infected, that computer's infected, that computer's infected. This is how a lot of infections are found inside networks is because they use sinkholes to do it. All right? So this is how we track malware. Anycast sinkholes. Anycast sinkholes is where I take my sinkhole address and I put it on many different sinkholes located in different parts of my network. Okay? So instead of, if I have a big national network, my network's spread all over the United States, instead of just putting my sinkhole in here in Detroit or wherever your headquarters is at, instead I take, here's a megapop, here's a megapop, here's a megapop, here's a megapop. I take, 6 different megapops, I configure a sinkhole each, all 6 megapops, and I put one address on each, and I anycast it into my network. Okay? So by anycast it into my network, now when I go through and I take that attack traffic to a customer, and I shunt it over to the sinkhole, it goes to the closest sinkhole. Right? So it's a way you can distribute the load out through your network. It's a way of distributing it out. You don't have to have as big of a sinkhole. You don't have to backhaul DOS traffic. Why backhaul the DOS traffic? Have it go to the closest one. Right? This is deployed. This is something that actually some people taught me because they started with one sinkhole and they went out there, oh, why don't I just anycast it? And they deployed it all over the place. Right? So I don't know if I can tell which provider is out there, but they do the anycast sinkholes with it. Right? So they work. And like take something like Configure. Configure, we had 5 different sinkholes already set up. And when Configure came up, we said we need to take and use DNS and take all the DNS that Configure is using for the control channel and shunt it into sinkholes and then monitor the sinkhole hits. Well, we took existing sinkholes and we took the IP addresses off the DNS and we put it into the different sinkholes. The sinkholes are already ready, set up, and ready to go. We didn't have those sinkholes ready to set up to go. When Configure happened, we wouldn't be able to respond to Configure as fast as we could. So that's why setting these up, you could set them up and do the minimal with them, and then have them ready to go when you need to do something. So this is part of the preparation part, too, with it. Okay? Now, how do you set up a basic sinkhole? This is, I actually walked somebody through this, and that person is here at this conference. I don't see him in the room, but I actually walked them through this. I said, just go get a box, load up TCP dump, and look at an MRTG graph, and put it into your network. Just start with one computer. And that's what he did. And he loaded up, and he started, advertised a bunch of bogons into his network. In other words, addresses that have not yet been allocated, advertised them in his network. They got all this garbage come down in there. They're like, wow, why is this going on in my network? Why do I have bogon? Why do I have people talking to bogon addresses in my network? This is interesting, all right? So it can start as simple as that, and then you can, basic infrastructure. You get a router, okay? You put, a switch inside, and you get computers inside here, and do analyzers, and you can just grow it out from there, right? You can put people put Arbor boxes in there. People, this is off of Arbor. This is his slide actually on it, right? So it quarantines with it. You can put backscatter traffic on there. So this grows up with it. And if you don't know about backscatter is a good presentation of backscatter from CADA. We still get backscatter, and backscatter has turned out to be a pretty useful tool. Last year, Kaminsky DNS. How many people heard about the Kaminsky DNS issue? Right? Very critical issue. How many people are monitoring their domain names with backscatter? Right? We should bring that up and refresh people. What we found out with Kaminsky DNS is if somebody went after Juniper networks, because we're doing that for Juniper, right? We're monitoring our backscatter, all right? Somebody went after Juniper networks. So I'm going to take, and I want a bunch of guys in China to go to Juniper.net in China with pirated Juniper gear, for example, right? And they would use the Kaminsky DNS to try to break into the caches and change the DNS around. Well, what would happen is Kaminsky DNS, we found, is very noisy backscatter-wise. So as they're hitting the server, the DNS server that they're hitting is sending replies back to the Juniper authority. So all we needed to do on our part for our Juniper.net authority is monitor backscatter. And then we can see who in the world, which DNS caches in the world is getting hit with the Kaminsky attack against our domain. All right? So backscatter, even though you go back to this 2001 paper that CADA first mentioned, backscatter is an example of one of those tools. So backscatter was really interesting in 2001, 2002. We saw a lot of data. Then we had other tools that kind of less interested. People still kind of looked at it, but it wasn't big. Then come last summer, all right? Then a colleague up in Canada realizes, hey, Kaminsky's noisy. It's looking up like backscatter all over the place. And we're like, now we have a way of detecting when somebody actually tries to use Kaminsky. All right? Backscatter. So toolkit, serviceware toolkit. You look at the toolkit, backscatter. If you don't know what backscatter is, check out this paper, right? Read about it. It's a very important tool, to go out there. Sinkholes is one of the best ways of monitoring the backscatter. Okay? So, you can monitor spoof ranges with it, right? You can put little classification access with it. There's a lot of different ways out there of doing it. So one of the deep dives I'm going to be working on getting over the next year is getting some of the guys who I've seen run really, really robust sinkhole infrastructure, and really convince them to say, come over here and give us the details. Give us good deep dive tutorials on this stuff. People have seen slides like these before, but what we need to get is really operational experience of some of the guys who do this stuff and have all their scripts and look at their scripts sort of thing with it. So others can say, hey, I can do the same thing. I can get this going. All right. Some safety precautions with sinkholes. No export. All right. And the reason I say no export is just think of what happened in Pakistan with YouTube. You don't want to run into one of those mistakes. All right. Other things are pulling the garbage out. And I kind of mentioned this. You get Your router, when you configure your aggregate on your routers, right, they're pulling in garbage anyways because you're advertising your aggregates out, being a good internet citizen. If I got a /19, I don't advertise my /24s, I advertise my /19. That's a good citizen. But a lot of that address space is dark IP address space, goes into your router here, it's useless, right? Packets get dropped, right? People have done where they put it over to a backbone router, but what you can also do is send it over to, your sinkhole over it. So send it to a sinkhole. Where's the slide? I guess I didn't have that slide in there. But send it into the sinkhole with it, right? Here's another example of Anycast sinkholes. Kind of covered all this. So, source address validation. Check our time real quick. BCP38. Basics of this, if you haven't heard this before, is any packet from your customer whose source address doesn't match what you have agreed to route, drop it. Okay? And so if you're my customer and I've allocated a block of addresses to you and you're sending me addresses that is not belonging to my block, I shouldn't be routing those packets through. Unless I have some sort of contract. But even if I have some sort of contract that says I do that, then I'll know what those addresses are. Okay? So that's basically what the technique is. There's an RFC on this, BCP38, RFC 2827. There's some talk about updating this because there's other techniques we can do with this and maybe some other things we should be doing. Like, do we DSCP code points, for example? Should we listen to any DSCP code point, or should we figure out what DSCP code points do I allow and which ones I don't allow, right? So there's talk about that. And we found that out because as certain providers have rolled out voice services, right? They found there was a direct correlation to them enforcing what I call DiffyServe phase 0. DiffyServe phase 0 is where I reset all the packets coming into my network to a DSCP code point of 0. And they found out that a bunch of security things disappeared off the network. Now, they were doing this to prepare for voice, QoS and voice, right? And they found a collateral benefit of security, right? So this is what it's at right now. It's on the source address, so people are looking at other things with it. Where do you filter? You filter on the edge. This isn't a service provider edge, right? Service provider edge, where I'm doing a peer-in, has always been a little bit more complicated about trying to do that dynamically and operationally, effectively. Because trying to maintain ACLs on the service provider edge is much harder than maintaining ACLs down here on the customer edge. So it's very much been a customer edge sort of technique. Principles around this is filter as close to your customer as possible, as precisely as possible, and try to do source and destination as much as possible. You can combine this, if you're doing ACL, you can combine this with the infrastructure access list. Many people do. There are a multitude of techniques now. There's a static access list, which a lot of people talk about. There's dynamic access lists. If you got AAA, AAA has capabilities where you can load dynamically an access list whenever that connection comes up. There's Unicast RPF, which is where I use the route table as my authority of what I do. So in other words, I do the lookup. If I have a forwarding path to the router, then I can use that forwarding path and look up the source address to see if that matches off the interface. Okay? There's cable source verified. This is actually in PCM, the DOCSIS 2 it got put in, right? It's DOCSIS 3. So this is in the DOCSIS spec with packet cable multimedia, right? And then the IP source verified, which is the Ethernet equivalent. And you find this in a new working group where they're trying to expand this in SAVI or SAVA, one of the working groups, SAVI, right? So with this there, so the new technology is about making this operationally cheaper to do, is what they're doing with it. But there are many providers who do this, and if you don't do this, then a lot of people encourage you to do this. Now, give an example where this is a threat. There are lots of OpenDNS cache resolvers out there. And these OpenDNS cache resolvers are very vulnerable, as we found out last year, to classes of DOS attacks that can have an amplification effect. In other words, a small packet going in will generate more bigger packets coming out of the OpenDNS resolver. And the thing that facilitates this is the ability of people to spoof addresses. right? And so we saw last year basically bad guys going after each other. You know, that's where we were fortunate. But we received collateral damage through a series of attacks last year from these bad guys going after each other. So it was basically two gangs, you know, whacking each other, right? So, but what it exposed is showed that, hey, if we had BCP38 deployed more ubiquitously across the internet, then this sort of attack would be harder to implement, right? Wouldn't eliminate it. We still need to close up DNS open resolvers. We're trying to make it harder for the bad guys to go out there and abuse the net in their favor, right? This has been successfully deployed in big providers, right? So big providers do this, right? And here's an example. You know, one provider took about 7 months to go through it and started on, you know, in the lab. And this is over at Cisco. Started on a Cisco lab, Unicast RPF. They went through on one router, and then one line card on one router, and then one router facing all the customers, and one POP, and several routers, and then finally adopted as a standard. And they went through step-by-step methodology until it became a default standard, default config. Every new router that came up was configured with this. They have total confidence around it. So a lot of times, if you're a big provider and you're not doing this, this is a matter of gaining confidence over time to get it done. And people have done it, right? So can be done. So took a lot of time, took a lot of patience. Unicast RPF doesn't work for all customers. One of the big providers in the United States uses Access List. They use Unicast RPF. Other big providers in the States use Unicast RPF, right? Other big providers use DOCSIS 3, you know? So there's different big providers all work it, right? So it works it out there. So, you know, cut the excuses. People say, oh, I can't do it because there's lots of different ways. And it's not just Unicast RPF ACLs. There's lots of different ways of doing it. Okay, control plane protection. Whoops. There's BGP security, you know, there's a lot of different attack vectors out there. Here's a couple of presentations that people can look at, you know, where we talked about different attack vectors of BGP. It's still, you know, scary when you look at BGP and you say, what would happen if, you know, the scenario I gave earlier where you got bad guys take 20 different routers in 20 different locations of the world that were BGP-speaking routers and deaggregated the net all simultaneously. What would happen to the net? Some interesting sort of things would happen to the net. Everything from routers falling over because either their FIBs or their ribs wouldn't be able to take in, you know, that number of prefixes, right? To flapping all over the place, and then networks getting disconnected because flat dampening would knock them off, to, you know, rerouted and traffic rerouted. It's a mess of different stress out there. And it will be one of those hard things to recover from. But yet that is a very real threat that we have today. And the bad guys are not doing it because the bad guys need the internet to stay up and stable for them to make their money. But you have politically oriented people and terrorists out there who want to disrupt, right? So the threat vector around this is actually, even though, you know, BGP hasn't changed much, you know, the importance of actually looking at this and making sure you're doing things to protect your control plane is actually even more serious, because we got these things, what we call multi-vector terrorist incidents, which is, you take, for instance, London with the tube bombings. Imagine what would happen with London and the tube bombings, and then somebody simultaneously deaggregate, you know, on 20 different routers, BGP, where now phone systems are going down because this stuff impacts phone voice. And you're having the cell phones off, and the telephone system off, and a terrorist attack, and what do you have in the population? Terror, right? So as that 20% we talked about, you know, that never gets fixed, and the badness is never going to go away because we don't have a way to knock down the doors and grab the guys, even though we know where they're at, you know, because we don't have an international legal system, and convergence all happening, this stuff becomes more and more critical, right? So I'm going to walk through this, right, because we have time constraint. But there's another from the NANOG in New York, you know, kind of keep you know, look at the more detailed presentation on that. So going after BGP, you have 4 big macro queues that go after BGP. You can saturate your queue paths, you can saturate the link, you can drop the TCP session, you cause the IGP to go down, the recursive lookups with it, right? So social engineering, attacking a routing device, going to the device itself, right? Once you enter the router, and we talked about this. People go out there breaking the routers. The most common way is they go out there and look for your customer routers who are multi-home. The most common way of doing it is to scan for Telnet and SSH. And then when they go on Telnet and SSH, what do they do? First password they try is Cisco. Second password they try is Juniper. Right? And then, that's what they do. And you all have customers who do that sort of thing out there. Okay? You have the receive punt pass. This structure in here and going after it inside of a router, this is a micro diagram of how a lot of routers are built. You have an ASIC over here. You have a CPU that supports the ASIC. This is your line card, right? And then over here is your route processor. BGP happens on the route processor. But the packet has to traverse this path over here to get to the route processor. And these paths over here you're talking about, a gigabyte link. Down here, this gets into a KPPS link or a megabyte link. So you got basically a big step-down function. So if you flood this link down here with a gigabyte of attack, these queue structures down here, you're going to basically tail drop BGP, tail drop your IGP, and you'll drop off. So this is another way you get hit with a router. This is where infrastructure access lists and things like that, are helpful to make resistance. Saturate the link. If I saturate the link, control packets can't get through, the link drops. Link drops, what happens? I withdraw routes, I get flapping incidences. Link comes back up. DOS attack, link goes down. Up and down, you get what you call DOS flap as it goes up and down. Okay? So these sort of things with the DOS flap as the link goes up and down, then cause flapping going on. Flap dampening goes in there and you get dampened out, it becomes even worse. Drop into TCP session, right? Drop into TCP session, I go out there and I match certain things. And I can spoof all this stuff. And then I just have to guess in there. Back in 2004, it was revealed that the TCP, if you have long-lived TCP sessions, okay, then you can sit there and start guessing, right? And you got this thing called window hopping. And you don't have to get as precise. All you have to do is get inside the window, which means you do this thing called window hopping. You take your sequence numbers and you just go, here's a sequence number, and you hop up the window, right? We're talking about, instead of tens of thousands of packets to knock down with a reset, we're talking about hundreds of packets, okay? So that's what happened in 2004. This hasn't changed because this is inherent to the way TCP was built, right? So this is a TCP, resiliency issue. But if you're not mindful of this and you leave your BGP sessions open where people can telnet and get a TCP packet to that BGP session, then it's vulnerable to this, right? Infrastructure access lists and some of the other techniques, this is what you use to take care of this. This is also where this technique, TTL security mechanism, right? Yes, before someone mentioned Juniper, we actually get in the feature, make it where you don't have to kludge it to make it work on Juniper. But the TTL security mechanism is set up where a lot of BGP sessions, especially eBGP sessions, when I'm peering with somebody, we're right next to each other, all right? So what you're doing is you're saying that when the packet leaves, like over here at Roland's router, and reaches my router, his TTL is 255, right? Now, by the time that packet reaches my BGP process, it will either be TTL 255 or 254. Depends where I decrement. It's very implementation dependent. So all I need to check and say, are you a TTL 255 or 254? Right? Do my check. If I'm like something larger, then you're not one hop away from me. Right? So there's lightweight techniques. So GTSM, general purpose TTL security mechanism, is one of the techniques out there you can use to defend and build more resiliency with it. Route authentication. Hopefully we get it out of TCPM. It's stuck in TCPM, but we'll get the update to MD5. The problem with MD5 out there today is MD5 and I've said for years, even though it adds resiliency, if you don't have it deployed today, I wouldn't recommend deploying it. Use GTSM. The reason why is because when MD5 was created, we didn't have mission critical services and multiple services with one BGP connection. MD5, you don't have a key, and you should be changing the key over time. The problem with MD5 is do a key exchange and change in the key, drops the session. You reset the session, All right. Now there's some kludges that we did halfway, but we're waiting for is the IETF to come out. They have arguments about the correct way of doing it, where we can actually reset a key without dropping the session. And that's our problems of MD5 today. So some people say, oh, you have to use MD5. The problem with MD5 is, we got big links of multiple services. Some of those services are regulated services. You can't just keep on changing the key and dropping those sessions off. Not a good thing anymore. But hopefully we'll get this coming to IETF soon with it. So there's MD5 stuff, out there. Dropping the IGP, OSPF and EIGRP open. One of the reasons why people have moved to IS in the different networks, one of the reasons they justify to use IS is it's not off-net attackable, right? So I can't sit on one side of the world and send a packet across and try to go after the IGP, right? So, so there's several providers who've done that sort of migration with it, right, of going after the IGP. Okay. Pakistan issue. Mentioned this before. Here's the link. If you don't know what I'm talking about, the Pakistan issue, when you pull up the slides, here's the link to the Pakistan issue. Basically, they were told they didn't like these videos that they did about the Pakistan government, and the government says, remove these videos, and they said, but we can't. It says, okay, remove YouTube. And then they black holed YouTube, remote trigger black hole, same technique I talked about, but they didn't put no export. So because they didn't put no export and didn't put a Murphy filter, Murphy filter is what I call a filter of last resort. So in BGP, I use this Murphy's rule of networking, right? Anything can go wrong will go wrong. So even though you put no export, you can put another filter and say, don't export these communities. In other words, you do two filters to make sure nothing leaks out. They didn't do either of them. So it leaked out to the world, and YouTube went to Pakistan for a little while, right? So malicious route injection, bad route information leak does leak out. I mean, we see leaks all the time. And unfortunately for us, we're not seeing many intentional leaks. The only intentional leaks we kind of see is every now and then certain spam runs. But just because it's out there, because you see accidental leaks, the accidental leaks means that all it takes is a bad guy to go out there and do an intentional plan, right? They can go out there and they can do that sort of stuff. So, it takes just a small number of incidents to go out there. And if anybody wants to look at how bad it can get, way back, the 7007 incident. 7007 incident is where a router deaggregated, caused massive damage out in the net. Now, certain providers weren't impacted, right? And the reason why they weren't impacted was, what happened with 7007 flooded out through the network, but this garbage in, garbage out happened, caused a lot of duress on the net, but there are certain networks, what they did is they did aggressive prefix filtering coming into the network. I'm going to flip through these slides on aggressive prefix filtering because we've got another tutorial you can look up on aggressive prefix filtering. The aggressive prefix filtering is where you say, I don't accept any BGP packet coming into me. I actually select what I come in. I select on boundaries. And there's a loose mode of doing it, and there's a strict mode of doing it. A strict mode of doing it is where I go through and say, here's what the regional registries say they're going to allocate, all right? And I'll take the boundaries that they give, and I'll be very strict on that. And then the other one is where I go down to things like the /24s, which is a looser method. But both of these techniques have proved, especially during the 7007, those service providers who were doing similar to that did not get impacted by this, right? So this is kind of protecting yourself, because somebody can be sitting on the other side of the planet, deaggregate the net, right? And are you going to accept all these /32s, right? Where's your boundary at? What will you accept, right? So I'll flip through these injection attacks with a prefix attack, and there's 20 different routers all spitting things into your network, and you go from an NGN to a no network. And what you can do is doing all the filtering with it. So, and if you have any slides to explain all this, I've got the slides right here for your management. Total visibility. Telemetry. This is what you're doing. Total visibility telemetry. This is not a new concept. You go to military realms, you go to power systems and things like that. You got to have a full situational view of what's happening on your network. The more data you can get in, in cost-effective way, the better. And fortunately for us, there's a lot of cost-effective ways of bringing data in to your network operations center to give you visibility of what's happening with it. We have access to lots of data that you can stream off of routers and switches. We got lots of probes and sensors we can put off of it. And so this is something really important. So simple things like NSP, Armon, NetFlow, right? So there's a lot of different addendums I put on here where you can pull some of the data out. This is a chart that actually Roland Dobbins did. It's quite good because what you're doing is a holistic approach, looking at the whole body, the whole system, right? And looking at the interactions between all the different components with it, right? So you want to listen to all the different components of the network and different parts, correlate it all together, right? So, and fortunately, there's tools out there that you don't have to go out there and buy right away. Now, of course, you have companies like, Arbor Networks says, oh, go look at our stuff right away. But another way of doing this, I've recommended people, is go download the freeware stuff first and fire at the freeware stuff, right? Because the freeware stuff, your capital cost is basically servers with disk space and open source tools, right, and freeware tools you load on it. And then with the open source tools, you start seeing what sort of data you can get. And then that starts giving you an indication of what sort of vendors you want to look at, because there's multiple vendors who actually bring this stuff down, but at least you broke the ice. And with your bosses, right, if you get permission and you say, hey, we need to start looking at this stuff and looking at flow data, all right, and getting flow data going into my network, your bosses will be more likely to upgrade what you have if you've started from freeware stuff, right? Because now they're seeing the data. And especially if you take the data and you start giving them in reports, right? And you start give product managers reports. Here's what's going on in my network. Because this is only not only for security, this is for understanding what's happening to your network, what your services are doing, what sort of performance things are happening. So there's a lot of different things you can do with this flow data. You got Stager out there, you got NSP data out there that you can look for different spikes with it. Armon, you still got a lot of Armon going on switches, a lot of switching technology out there. Here's an example of BGP. Monitoring BGP itself. Right? BGP actually had aberrations that happen with it. So it's not just like, oh, let's look at NetFlow. You want to look at what happens with your routing protocols and graph that stuff, because your routing protocols will give you indications of what happens with it. You take like a Arbor and Packet Design, both have where they take the routing protocols in, and you look at the routing protocols for stability and resiliency, also for security. You can correlate and see stuff that happens with security aspects of it. Yeah, there's a sound effect with it. So, and then correlating the data with the flow data and the routing data together, you can see what's happening, what is the impact with it. Now, where this all comes in with total visibility is there's a theme we're heading down. And the theme we're heading down is when people say, well, I'm doing all this SP security stuff, I'm starting with these top techniques, and your management will say, well, how do I know this is working? How do I know this is going to work? Fortunately for us, we now know how to measure this. It's called a service level agreement. It's an SLA you give to yourself. So what I call is you basically set up a service level agreement with yourself internally. It's like an SLA 0. And it's the service level tools that we're using for SLA that you get for your customer, the IPPM tool set. You take the IPPM tool set, you deploy it in your network, and that becomes your measure. Because any sort of DOS attack, security attack, things like that, becomes SLA variations. And you can measure that. And you can count that and use that as an effectiveness tool to find out whether it's working or not. Whether these tools you use and these techniques you use when stuff happens, how can you measure it? How can you go to your bosses every year and says, how many SLA impact and DOS attacks have we have? And that's what you want to talk to your boss with. How many SLA impact and DOS attacks have we had? How long did it take to resolve those SLA impact and DOS attacks? How many FCC reportable DOS attacks do we have, right? How many voice impact and DOS attacks do we have, right? And you can count these and then measure the effectiveness of how long it took to restore the SLA level. DOS attack happened here at T0. It took me 10 minutes to fix it. Okay? And it's measurable. Now, the measurement is about the visibility. And that's where we're getting at with the visibility. Because IPSLA, right, the IPPM tool set is visibility. It's visibility, latency, jitter, packet performance going across the network, right? So we're using them all that. Syslog, right? NTP, right? Correlation with that. Packet captures, right? All this is the visibility. So let me give an example. So we close up with this, is working the attack. So DOS attack, SLA violation. Hacker goes in there, goes and attacks the network. What do you tell the boss? All right, so I got an SLA violation over here, right? So what you're trying to do is figure out what to do with this packet. And in the internet, when a packet goes in the network, one of two things are always going to happen to that packet. Number one, the packet's going to get delivered. Number two, somebody's going to pay for it to get dropped. Somebody's going to pay for it to get dropped, right? Now, is that going to be your router? Is it going to be your customer's router, right? Who pays for it to get dropped? So here's our 6 phases. So our sit rep here is everything's normal, right? Then alarm goes off. Target is getting taken out. I got collateral damage going on, right? So now with the attack in progress, so I got a collateral damage incident. So I not only got a customer screaming, a customer may not have called me yet. Customer may not know the DOS attack. But what I do know is my alarms went off, and I got a PE router down. Okay? So my alarms and my NOC says PE router's down. I got a DOS attack in progress. I got collateral damage. So what's the first thing you do? This is a triage. Fix the collateral damage. Don't fix the customer problem. Fix the collateral damage. All right? Solve the collateral damage issue. So I'm going to take the customer, sacrifice the customer, and say I'm going to push this DOS attack back. All right? I'll do a remote trigger black hole. So now I got the collateral damage mitigated. I pushed the attack up. All my other customers are restored. That customer is still hit by the attack. So now I got the guy as a partial service. So I've restored partial service. DOS attack is still active. Now I'm going to go through and I got some options. Where's my toolkit? I can use a sync call. I can watch a DOS. I can activate clean pipes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out there and I can do community-based drops. Remote trigger black hole I can set up by communities and drops in different sections. Right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to monitor attack, use BGP community take, and send to one of my regional sinkholes. So what I'm going to do is over here, I use a community-based trigger, and I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to see which one goes to a sinkhole, and says, okay, over here, this is the one that went to the sinkhole. So I know the attack is coming in from this section of my country, of my network. All right? And I'm sending it over to a sinkhole. Now inside the sinkhole, I go and I'm going to analyze it. So now I go in here, it says, okay, now the DOS attack is still active. I'm going to provide the customer with some clean pipe service. I'm going to say, now I'm going to do a clean pipe service over to you. So now clean pipe service is a full service recovery. This is where they're under attack and they're going to get their complete service restored. Right? So you need a special tool to do that, special product out there to do that sort of stuff. So I'm going to shunt it over there. And the way I'm going to shunt it over is with BGP. So these are the basics. If you haven't got any of them deployed right now, if you haven't started on that, then this gives you some guidelines how to start it. You can download the slides. There's more addendum slides over here. There's other talks you can pull up in NANOG with this. There's our talk tomorrow at the NSP Security BOF, right? So you can come, I strongly encourage you to come over, meet people. Anybody you see with a black dot, introduce yourself. If you want to talk to me, you can introduce yourself to me, talk to me. There's other people I can point to. I'll point to Roland and Chris Morrow over here. There's other people around that I can point to who'd be welcome to talk to you and a lot of times collaborate with you. You'll find in the NSP security world, the service provider security world, we're very collaborative. We kind of share, here's what we do with each other a lot within the community because we hope that you will also do it because we know if you do it, it makes us stronger. Because if you do it, then when something happens, we can work together with the same techniques and stuff. Right? So that's what we're doing with it. And then stay tuned in this next year. We're going to have more security talks over this next year. That's very service provider security oriented. Right? So we're getting some more of our peers to come in and talk and kind of talk what they do with it. So thank you very much for coming. And I guess now the buses will be running and we can go off to our event tonight and have fun. And we'll see you around NANOG this week. Thank you very much.